On this episode of Still Loading, Gareth Coker. Hello everyone and welcome to this new episode of Still Loading. My name is Josh, the host of the Still Loading podcast, and I am beyond excited for today's guest. On today's episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing Gareth Coker. Gareth is the composer for the Ori series, Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and I am a gigantic fan of these games. You have no idea how excited I was to be able to interview him. He has also composed music for Minecraft, some of the expansions in Minecraft, as well as Ark Survival Evolved, the MMO game, and Darksiders Genesis. So he has done a ton of work in video games, and I was so excited to sit down and talk to him. Well, not actually sit down. He's over in LA, and I'm over here over on the East Coast, so a little bit different there. But I was so happy to get to talk to him. So without further ado, here is my interview with Gareth Coker. Today on the show, I am beyond excited to have a composer on with me, and this is a very special interview for me because for those who have listened to the podcast for a while and those who have maybe heard my guest appearance on the No Geeks Allowed podcast, I listed the first game in the series as my favorite game of the last decade. And the man who I'm interviewing right now, he composed the music for both that game and its sequel, Ori and the Blind Forest, Ori and the Will of the Wisps. And the composer for both those games is Gareth Coker. Gareth, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, thanks. Great to be here.
First question for you: how are you doing during all this? How are you doing during the pandemic? Are you faring all right? How's everything going over on your? Well, you're over in LA right now, I believe. How's everything going for you out there?
Well, yeah, it's a question that comes up frequently with friends and family, and I have to admit I'm used to being at home by myself. I've always kind of been a hermit. I don't get cabin fever for whatever reason. I think I'm very fortunate in that respect. But also you have to consider that composers spend most of their time at home anyway, because almost all of us are working out of our home studios. Mm-hmm. So on a personal level, I haven't found the transition to be any different. I also, long before this all started, I'd pretty much transitioned to what I would call online living. I get my food delivered. Pretty much everything gets delivered now.
Oh, wow.
I mean, even groceries, it's actually, I actually transitioned from groceries to meal kits, because while I'm a good cook, I don't like cooking, if that makes sense. Because it just takes too much time. So and also I was very, very busy in 2019, so I was like, what is the healthiest way I can keep eating good food but not have to spend time going to the store and stuff like that? So on a personal level, I'm doing fine, but I have tremendous sympathy for obviously there's a ton of people who are not working at the moment, and also, the prospects, unfortunately, don't look great for at least the immediate future. I think after this next spike, which was inevitable due to the protests, I think after that passes, we can actually finally maybe work together to fix the thing. But it's going to be a rough next month for sure. I don't think we're going to have any downturn until August. I think July is going to be, unfortunately, pretty brutal, but it may be it may finally wake everyone up. Wear the damn mask.
I know, right?
I usually refrain from making blanket statements, but it's just pretty obvious at this point. The mask works, and it's not hard. You don't even need to buy a special mask. You can literally just cover your face, and that would be better than nothing.
Exactly.
It's been a little bit frustrating living here, seeing how this country has dealt with it. I'm from Britain. I don't think Britain's done a great job. And then you look at other countries who are doing a much better job, and it's like, well, come on, why is it like this over here? But if there is a silver lining to the very cloudy landscape. I think there's going to be a global recalibration how people work and how people live from all of this, and it will be for the better. Just as a quick example, I think the 5-day work week will pretty much be gone, because I think a lot of companies have realized that, oh, we don't need our employees to come in every day. I think you're going to see gradually a shift in how contracts are structured. For example, you'd be like, can you come in like 3 days a week or 4 days a week, and then you have some much more flexibility on your time. So I think there will be some long-term changes in society that benefit us as a whole, because I think people have realized that in many, many jobs, you just don't need to be at the workplace all the time, and actually be more efficient at home, or not feeling compelled to go to work, not feeling like you have to, going in when you want to. And that's a very different mindset, and it's a much healthier mindset for people when they're actually doing their work, and they become as a result more efficient. Unfortunately, we won't see the results of that for like another 2 or 3 years, but I do think there are several things like that are going to improve us as a society as a whole. I mean, I think everyone will take hygiene much more seriously now.
I would hope.
you would hope, although with not everyone paying attention, like the last month or two, it's you hope the message will get through eventually. But the thing is, humans are resistant to change. One of the comparisons I've made is, whenever your favorite website, whether it's BBC, Facebook, Twitter, or whatever, whenever it goes through a redesign, literally everyone hates it. Like there's almost no one who can see like the benefits of the redesign. And then a month later, you're like, man, this redesign is really good. Like, wow, it really helps me. And I think there is a similar thing on a much more drastic level with how people are handling this pandemic. People are resistant to change, but as time passes, the masks will become normalized. I truly believe that. And I think people will get over their outrage and, I shouldn't be told what I'm supposed to be doing. People will get over it and realize, it's not actually a big deal. But there tends to always be a pushback when something major happens that like alters the way you work or the way you consume something. I think that's what we're seeing right now, unfortunately. I wish there was a little bit more urgency, but humans gonna human. That's exactly.
And it's
about the best way I can put it.
I mean, as with anything, like anything that challenges your personal norm is always going to be, it's going to have a backlash, even if the people whose minds get changed or this and that, even if that happens, you still have that initial like, oh, that doesn't make sense to me. And then you have to like really analyze it from a different perspective, at least for a while. Then hopefully, like you said, it becomes normalized.
Yeah, exactly.
So, wow, that was what an intro.
That was a heavier in-depth opening than I was expecting.
No, but it's all good.
But honestly, it's on everyone's mind anyway. Like there's not a single person who isn't thinking about this every single day. So,
no, and that's why anytime I especially now with everything going on, I wanted to kind of start off with that just to kind of. Because, I mean, everyone's mental health right now is especially so important just because it's good to kind of get that frustration or whatever it is out so that way you can feel more, you can just feel better. Like venting is such an important thing.
Yep.
Okay, so to dive into this, I am predominantly a gaming podcast. Well, not predominantly, I am. I cover video games, retro and modern. So I wanted to ask you about kind of a little bit about yourself in terms of your history in your gaming. Like what got you into video games, or did you play them as a kid, or did you get into them later in life? And depending on how you got into it, what types of games do you enjoy to play?
Yeah. So I am definitely a gamer. I would not be what you would call a hardcore gamer. I just play a lot of games. I've been gaming since I was 4. On my first machine that I remember gaming on, I don't think it even came out in America because it was by a British company, but it's called the ZX Spectrum.
Yes, the Spectrum. Okay. I don't know a lot about gaming over in the UK. I do know that it was heavily based around microcomputers, which I guess you would say the ZX Spectrum, right?
ZX. I said it for your American audience, or it's been here too long. Yeah.
No, you're good, man. I listened to a podcast called Retronauts, which I've talked about them to hell and back on this show before. They have no idea who I am, but they've had people on who know more about it than they do because they're Americans like me, so they didn't grow up with it. So I'm fascinated by the microcomputer scene over in the UK and like how gaming evolved from there. It's interesting to me.
So yeah, I mean, again, my memories of that time are obviously a little fuzzy, but I distinctly remember my father just handing me a book and was just like, it was just a book of code. And if I typed up all of the code in the book, then Space Invaders would come on screen. Like that's basically because that was when graphics were done with binary code, like one for a pixel to appear and 0 for a pixel to not appear. And then the code is just defining a 100 by 100 pixel block or whatever it was. Probably 10 by 10 actually. And so just like that was how I learned to type really quickly. Because I never remember even learning to type. I just like you inhaled knowledge and you learn things really quickly when you're a kid. And so that's like my first memory of gaming is like literally typing up games so I could play them.
That's crazy.
And then of course if the game doesn't start, you have to find the bug or find out why you didn't.
So you had to learn
type up correctly. Yeah, exactly. So I just learning how to read. Yeah, I learned how to program. I would definitely not call myself a programmer, but I do like distinctly remember that. Computers got a bit more advanced and like so my early gaming days were on the Spectrum and Amiga, like these older systems where you have to put the cassette tape in and wait like 20 minutes for it to load. And then Windows.
Blow a lot of my listeners' minds. Right. Not a lot of people know that games could come on cassette tapes. Like that's something that's so foreign in the US. I mean, I've seen it. I have not personally seen it in person, but I've like obviously read up on it. But sorry, continue on.
If you go onto YouTube, you can see plenty of videos of literally the loading screens from cassette tape gaming.
That's crazy.
And I feel like a bunch of your viewers are now like listeners are scrambling to
that
look
exists?
That up.
What?
It's crazy. Like the screen all flashes a weird color, and you're sitting there for a long time. It makes the most horrendous sound. But yeah, it's literally the tape head scrubbing, and the data is being read off the magnetic tape. And you wait, and then it loads, and of course you really have to take care of your tapes because obviously that's it. If you screw them up, like you have to be really careful with them. Then Windows came out, and then I think these are the first like significant memories. Like the Spectrum stuff and the programming is cool, but like the first like actual gaming memories I had that like still stick with me today are the old LucasArts adventure games.
Okay, I'm actually playing through Secret of Monkey Island for the first time right now.
All of those games, the ones that I remember the most are the Star Wars simulator games, so X-Wing, TIE Fighter. When you think back that those games came on 5 floppy disks and they contained like 60 missions and some basic voice acting as well. Like I do not understand how they got all of that data onto one disk. Oh, and interactive music, by the way. And so those Star Wars games, Day of the Tentacle, Maniac Mansion, Full Throttle, The Dig, Grim Fandango a little bit later on. I also one of the first games I actually played on a console was Final Fantasy VII. Those are like the experiences I remember. I tend to gravitate towards single player adventure games, action games. The games I'm good at, it's easy for me to say what I'm bad at. I'm not good at shooters. So when I play a shooter, I'm just like, I put it straight on easy mode. I want to play the campaign and then I'm done.
I gotcha.
So I have no real interest in multiplayer gaming. It's not that I'm an antisocial gamer. It's just that games like Fortnite or World of Warcraft, they never end. Like
I'm with you on that. I played WoW a lot, but I'm not like a multiplayer gamer either.
Yeah, League of Legends. I understand totally why people love this kind of stuff because there's a massive community aspect and like you're hanging out with your friends and all of that stuff. But it's just not for me. Had I grown up at a different time, then maybe I'd be playing them more. But I need my games to end because I play games for the experience. I want to get to the ending of games because I always feel like developers put a lot of work into their endings, and a lot of people don't actually reach them because games are really, really long.
Yes, or difficult.
Or difficult, exactly. So yeah, all of my the vast majority of my favorite gaming experiences are on the shorter side. There are a few exceptions, Final Fantasy VII being one of them, and I will confess to being a massive Assassin's Creed fan. I've played every single game in the series. I have 100%ed every single game in the series, including all the DLC. It is a game that I will make time for every year. I don't care that it's largely the same game every year. I just love getting lost in the world like that. It's experiential gaming as opposed to gaming for the sake of difficulty. There's plenty of games that I can play for difficulty, and here's the games that I'm good at. I'm really good at platformers, so I guess it makes sense that we're going to be talking about a platform.
Yes.
I'm going to do a slight flex now. I've A+'d every level on Cuphead.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So, so like because to me, for whatever reason, there's no difference between the difficulty modes on Cuphead because it's all pattern recognition to me. Once I see the pattern, then it's just all about execution. And the thing about seeing patterns is once you see them, everything slows down like to almost nothing. You feel like you're in tempo with the game, and it's obviously a very rhythmic game as it is. So once you see the patterns, there is literally no difference between difficulty modes in Cuphead. It's just the amount of stuff that's happening on screen. And once I've deciphered it, it's not a problem for me to play. With that, I'm also pretty good at fighting games because it is
that kind of has a rhythm to it as well.
It does have a rhythm to it, though. You obviously have to learn a lot more because the very best human players are unpredictable. So that's always a really fun challenge. I can use the way to beat me in a fighting game is to make me think that you're in a rhythm and then just change it, and then I'm screwed. So because I can't stop my brain from seeing the patterns. So if you get into a pattern against me and then change it up like when I'm least expecting it, that's pretty much how you beat me in a fighting game. My fighting game of choice is Tekken by far.
Okay.
I always like the speed and fluidity of that game. Mortal Kombat is a bit more muscular for me. I don't like the feel of it as much. It's still very enjoyable to play, especially with all the gory, over the top, ridiculous, cartoony violence that it has. And Street Fighter, I just never really jived with it. I feel like Street Fighter is ultra hardcore. Tekken has that kind of sweet spot where I think that anyone just getting started can button mash and feel like they're having a good time, but an experienced player can kind of make mincemeat of someone who's button mashing. So those games which are easy to pick up but hard to master, those are the kind of multiplayer games that I love playing. And with that, I can also say that I love Rocket League.
I have not tried that. I've heard good
things.
Things.
There's someone in the world that hasn't tried Rocket League?
Yes, I am one of the few. I am one of the few.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what your console of choice is, but I feel like it's always available for next to nothing at this point. It is worth your time and money if you're on. I think it's on Game Pass. Even if it's not, it's still worth your time and money.
I have literally. Well, I shouldn't say literally. I have the majority. I'm a collector, so I could get it on PC, Xbox One, right. PS4, whichever it is. I pretty much have. I mean, I have consoles back to the Atari 2600. Not trying to sound like I'm bragging or anything, because that's
impressive.
Spent a lot of time and money, and I'm surprised my wife even married me. But yeah, no, I'll have to give that a shot. I've been meaning to. And as what you were saying before with fighting games, I think that's probably one of the reasons I'm not good at them. I am so bad at pattern recognition in games. The same thing, even if you go back to like the original Nintendo with like Mega Man games, I brute force those bosses because I'm so bad at recognizing the patterns of their attacks. And it's also why I'm bad at games like Dark Souls, because all of that is just like pattern recognition, and I don't see patterns. I just see button mashing. So it's a big problem. And you were talking also, just one more callback, you were talking before about the LucasArts games and talking about how they had interactive music. That you might actually already know it just because you seem to have a pretty strong interest in it. The iMuse system is what they used to. I remembered it. I had to Google it again because I could not remember the name of it. But that was like, it was such a cool idea. But I remember also hearing like, very few people noticed because you had to have like a top end PC or top end computer to even get to iMuse to work, and most people didn't, so they didn't get to have this amazing interactive music experience, which is kind of a bummer because they put a lot of work into it.
The thing about you're going to get me on. You've gotten me onto one of my pet peeves, and it's this thing about whenever a game gets reviewed now. People are surprised when it has like music that changes on the fly with the game. I'm like, that is now one of the basic requirements of video game music. Journalists and reviewers should not be surprised when games have changing music. What they should be paying attention to is the execution of the concept that was pretty much invented more than 2 decades ago.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And it's about like when the music changes, and is it changed in a graceful way? Does it take away from the immersion, etc., etc. And the IMU system, conceptually, it is just all it's doing is changing based on certain triggers that happen in the game. Like when a Star Destroyer arrives, the Imperial March plays. It's pretty simple, but it happens every time, and it makes it feel like an event. It makes sense. There's a visual or a gameplay justification for the music changing. One of the things that drives me nuts in games is when the music changes and you're like, well, what the hell is going on? The classic one, and it's an unfortunate problem that always comes up in open world games, is like the combat music starts.
Yes.
And I'm just like, what? But where is the combat? Like, you can't see anything on screen, and it's just like you've got this. Sometimes it's not too epic. Sometimes it might be a light combat music, but basically you've got drums hammering away, and it's like, I can't see what I'm supposed to be fighting, so there's no justification. All this music's telling me that I'm in danger, but there's nothing on screen to tell me that. And I think one of the mistakes a lot of games make is that they use music to over communicate, when actually the sound effects themselves can be enough to tell you. Like, you don't need music to tell you that you're getting beaten up by a monster when there's like a whole cacophony of amazing monster sound effects that are also telling you that. It's about what I would hope for reviewers, journalists, and people just playing games to be looking for in this next generation, because I think we're really advancing into some exciting territory in games. I want people to be able to pay attention not to the music and what it's doing, because it is going to always be changing, but how well is it executed. I think that's the shift I would like to see now, because the whole, the music changes dynamically. Come on, man. It's been around for decades. We had a similar problem, and I think it's kind of past now, is that video game music has come a long way since bleeps and bloops. And I'm like, yeah, we've been having orchestras in games since like 2003, maybe
even earlier than that.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the first, I don't know, I think this is the first orchestrated game. I don't know 100% for certain because I don't have the research in front of me, but the original Medal of Honor from like 98 was one of the first fully orchestrated games. And actually, that was one of the first game series that got me into my love of video game music, and it was done by Michael Giacchino, who now obviously has gone on to do, like Pixar movies and stuff like that.
Well, you know how that happened, right?
No, I don't.
It's pretty simple. J.J. Abrams' son was playing Medal of Honor, that Medal of Honor game, or maybe it was J.J. Abrams himself. But basically, J.J. discovered Michael through Medal of Honor.
That's crazy. That's awesome.
I'm 99% sure that's the story. I feel like it would be on Google at this point, or Wikipedia or whatever. So if I'm incorrect, then feel free to smite me. But like that is the story that I've heard. It may just be one of these urban myths at this point, but I do think Giacchino's work was discovered through his excellent early gaming work. But yeah, it's like we come a long way from that. So like, let's not be excited about X game has a full orchestra or whatever. That's been around for a while. Again, like, if it has a full orchestra, let's pay attention to how well that orchestra is being used in the game. That's my pet peeve at the moment. I've got that out of the way.
I was going to ask then, would you say like something that, I mean, I am not a composer or a musician. Yep. I was actually in concert band pretty much from my elementary school all the way up through high school. so I do have a little bit of music background, but would you say that they like in terms of focusing on the execution, like you say, do you think juxtaposition is an important thing to keep an eye or an ear out, I guess, for? For example, to kind of bring it towards the Ori games, I noticed that not like you said, you don't hear the combat music every single time there's combat. And Ori, that would be insane because there's so much combat in the game, but you have different music shifts for when a big event is happening, like a big boss fight, and you have or something along those lines. So instead of having music for every single combat situation, you just use combat music, for lack of a better term, because it's more, I guess it would be more themes depending on the boss. You focus on that, so that way those moments have a much larger impact on the audience.
That is exactly the philosophy. I can dive into that a little bit. So
go for it.
So the philosophy behind the lack of combat music, you've hit the nail on the head, is that it provides meaning to when you are actually required to fight something. Mm-hmm. We only play combat music when you have to defeat something to continue making progress in the game. There are a couple of areas in Will of the Wisps and in Blind Forest actually, where you get gated in, like you literally cannot continue until you've defeated the monsters on screen, and then the gates open. So in those situations, because there is a visual justification, and on the screen, the gates have shut, and we need to tell the player, like, you're in combat and you need to fight, it makes sense. But like when you're just wandering through the forest, and by the way, there's an ability called Bash, which means you can actually like avoid every single monster in the game if you want to, because Bash allows you to rebound off monsters, all their projectiles. You literally don't have to fight anything if you don't want to. Now, most people will because they want that sweet spirit light.
Spirit orbs, yeah.
Right, exactly. But you don't have to. And my opinion is that for Ori, the sound effects do more than enough to communicate to the player that they're in combat. And also, if the player enters combat, it's their choice to enter combat. And it's not the game telling you, oh, you're in combat now, therefore you must fight. Like I said, the only time we do that is when you're gated in and we need you to make progress. But when you're just wandering around the world, I think it's more empowering to the player because they're choosing when to fight. And so having music do that, I mean, just imagine how gimmicky it would be if you had combat coming in and out
that would be like every 2 seconds.
It would just be terrible. So as a result, it gives us much more room to dial up the intensity for when the fights really, really do matter. And I think one of Ori's like best things in terms of the overall audio presentation is the dynamic range of the game. Like when it's quiet, it's insanely quiet, and when it's loud, it hits you in the face. And we're not afraid. We're not afraid to do that. I mean, one of the things I know I shouldn't, but I read all the comments anyway.
It's a slippery slope.
It is a slippery slope, but you can learn from it. But I do remember reading that like someone was like, oh man, this game really hits you in the face, and it's a bit like a musical sledgehammer. And I'm like, that it's literally like criticizing Lion King for playing full choir at the moment that Mufasa dies. Like, it's there's a style and an aesthetic to the game which justifies that approach. We're not to do the opposite. We're not doing what Inside are doing, which is very, very, very subtle throughout that game's experience, because the aesthetic requires Inside to be subtle. There's nothing subtle. There's nothing subtle about Ori. You only have to look at it for 2 seconds to realize that it's a bit over the top. It is on the nose, but since when was being on the nose a problem? That was like it really depends on what you are kind of expecting going into the game. A good comparison is E.T. Like the big moment in E.T. when they fly into the air. It's just not subtle, and that's absolutely fine. It's about to get back to the question about like the tailoring of combat music. It is about tailoring the music to the overall experience that you want to give the player, and that's why we kind of landed on the combat music approach over these 2 games. It gives things space to breathe, including the player, which is important. But then
Yes.
when we really want you to feel the music or feel the sound, we have room to go there.
It's a perfect point to make, because it, like, there's the first time I noticed combat music in a game, or like a dynamic shift, and I was a little bit slow in the intake because I didn't really like notice it, which I guess might mean that the sound design isn't the greatest. Who knows? Because generally, what is that saying? Like, if good sound design or good music design music is at its best when it's not noticed necessarily, unless it's meant to be noticed, type of
Yeah,
thing. And the first time I noticed it was in BioShock Infinite when I was playing it, because the combat music is really like pulse pounding, and then there is
yeah,
nothing outside of it, and
yep,
it always ends with this little string, like,
yep, yep.
every single time. And I love that game to pieces, and it didn't take me out of it. I mean, I guess it technically did because I noticed it, but it like, I wasn't upset by it, but it was just kind of like, it's something where I'm like, oh wow, there's music every time I'm in combat right now. That's kind of interesting. And
It all depends on the design. See the person who audio directed BioShock, her name escapes me, but she's a genius. Oh man, it's going to annoy me.
I can look it up real quick while
Yes, the approach to music in BioShock is consistent across the three games, so it doesn't really matter. It's all about tailoring what is the right feel for that game. Like, did they need that ending stinger at the end of combat? Probably not, but it also is just kind of like a fun thing. It's like, oh, this is over, and now you really know it's over. Get back to exploring this really strange world.
trying to find it. I found the composer. Didn't find the sound designer.
Composer is Gary Scheinman. The name is going to escape me. It's going to annoy me now, but
that's fine. I'm gonna I'll see if I can find it on, like, a lot of times IMDb has the full like credits list, which it's impossible to find everywhere else.
It's Emily Ridgway.
Okay.
Yes, it was just going to annoy me until I found it, but Now I don't know how the game was made, but I feel like when there is a great relationship between the composer and the team making the game, and that can sometimes be direct, like I had on Ori. Like, I was directly like wired in to Moon Studios. But on lots of projects, a composer will work with an audio director who understands that composer's music and the best way to have it play back in the game, and then you get a result like you hear on BioShock. That's the key. Is it's just like making sure that there is someone, whether it's you, the composer, or someone on the audio team, that is, because it's one aspect of game music to write the music, but the actual key is making sure it is played back and implemented properly in game. Because it doesn't matter how good the music is, it could be done by John Williams or James Newton Howard or whoever. It doesn't matter how good the music is. If it doesn't play back and sync right in the game, it's not going to feel right. And especially in this next generation of gaming, like, I think music implementation is getting better, but we're still not quite there yet. I still think there's a lot of things that can be finessed and improved. But I think in this next generation of gaming, we've got the resources now to record these incredible sounding soundtracks. The music is going to be good. I think the standard of game music is incredibly high. The standard of game music implementation is the next level. And it doesn't mean like having this crazy interactive music system. It's just about finding what is the best way to play back the music in the game, whether it's breaking it apart into like millions of lots of different stems and recomposing tracks on the fly, or like the approach for Ori, where it's largely horizontal and the music only changes when something on screen or in the game justifies that change. It's all about it's going to be all about the execution as opposed to the ideas, and that's kind of a fun place to be.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think you did like, and not just to make it seem like I'm trying to like suck up to you, but like, I think like the way it was implemented in Ori was really well executed, and I think your score for Ori is fantastic. I literally listened to the entire Will o' the Wisp soundtrack, or like score or soundtrack, from start to finish yesterday while I was at work. And it was cool because I actually streamed Ori later that night, and it was cool then to hear, now that I could like put a name to each of the tracks as I was playing through the game, like, oh, I remember listening to that earlier today, and hearing how it all implemented it. And the cool thing is that I couldn't remember when the track started within the game. I was just in the middle of the piece. I'm like, oh, this is track whatever. One question I did have about just Ori in general, was there any difference in composing Blind Forest to Will of the Wisp, and not just necessarily in terms of your approach, but also I would assume there was an increased budget for Will of the Wisps. And the increased budget have any positive or negative effects as you went through or in between Blind Forest and Will of the Wisps?
Definitely no negative effects. I mean, I could probably find some negative effects if I really looked. But well, so the first thing I was able to. So one of the big things about Ori is like the sound palette, because a lot of people refer to Ori as an orchestral soundtrack, but there's actually a lot going on with the orchestra that makes the Ori soundtrack what it is and what gives it its identity. There's just a lot of processed sounds in the background that kind of come in and out. If you listen really carefully, it's much more obvious in the quieter cues. Like the quieter cues are generally just like some strings, but there's other cool stuff happening that gives it a unique flavor. Now, the other cool stuff, as I like to refer to it, that takes time. It takes time to find like those sounds and get them working together. And also just sourcing that stuff is very difficult. So one of the things I was able to do is actually hire a sound design and music design company. They basically design virtual instruments based on a bunch of specifications. And I was like, I need some Ori sounds. And they're like, what does that mean? And then I described to them what that means. And then they go away and record some stuff for me so that I can play it back on my computer setup. And just like having that worry be removed allowed me to spend more time on writing. A great example from the soundtrack, which features their work. The company's called Slate and Ash. They've done work on Arrival, the film, and Into the Spider-Verse, so they've got a pretty decent track record. A track from the Ori soundtrack where their work is prevalent is In Wonderment of Winter. Literally all the bell sounds you hear at the beginning of that track were created by them and then played back by yours truly. And then I combined it with everything else in the piece. It's just like stuff like that. I could do it myself because I did do it all myself on Ori, but this was a much bigger game, and it just like, you know, the game's soundtrack is 3 hours long as opposed to the first game, which is 90 minutes, so it's twice as long. And it just allowed me to focus more time on the composing. So that's just like one simple example. The other is obviously we got to record with a bigger orchestra. I think the smaller orchestra for Blind Forest does have a unique charm to it. It kind of makes the score stand out by itself. But the game's themes in Ori 2 are definitely different and a little bit weightier. I felt that a bigger orchestra would reflect that, especially by the time you get to the end of the game. You really can feel the weight of everything that is happening in the story, probably peaking with the final boss fight, which is the track Shriek and Ori, which coincidentally is by far the most popular track on YouTube and Spotify. So that's kind of cool that like people have gotten that far in the soundtrack and in the game and have enjoyed that track the most. But like the whole game kind of builds that point, and I don't think that track we'd have been able to execute that track if we'd recorded with the same size orchestra that we did for the first one. Yeah, because it just needed weight. There's something about a lot of humans playing at the same time in the same room that you really feel the weight and heft of music. Ori 1's music is light and has a naive charm to it, but there isn't much about Ori 2 that is naive and charming, and that's like a subtle difference in the game from game 1 to 2. I think what I would actually like to see in the future, and I feel like someone will do this eventually, is actually set it up so you can play Ori 1 and 2 like immediately back to back, because Ori 2 is a direct continuation of Ori 1, like literally. Yes. It continues, like the story doesn't stop, and I feel like you could literally glue the games together and then play them through from start to finish, and you'll actually get an even better experience with how the music evolves from the very first note of the first game to the very final note of the second game. I feel like that would be an interesting thing to see. Yeah. I feel like someone's going to do it. Maybe even Microsoft, but who knows? But that's like an approach that a larger budget allowed us to cater for. And I guess the last thing that's worth talking about is that the implementation in the second game is vastly superior to the first game. I mean, the first game's implementation is the most smoke and mirrors. I mean, the whole game is kind of a Frankenstein. And we didn't have any audio middleware for the first game, and we were able to get the audio working. For the second game, we did, and while it took us a while to get up and running, it allowed us to do things in the music that I just know we couldn't have done in the first game. So one of the things, I'm going to try and not get too technical, but one of the things about a Metroidvania is that there's so many different states in the game, and the way we get music to change is we need the music to track a game state. So for example, just a very simple example, the first environment in Will of the Wisps, Ori wakes up in a new location and he's kind of lost. There's this sad piece of music playing, so that's like Ori level 1, beginning of the game. That's just like a state. Ori has nothing. Yes. You progress through the level, and eventually you pick up a sword. Now that sword that triggers a little sequence. That's a game state. And we have a piece of music to reflect that. Now here's the key part. Then there's another game state afterwards that's just like Ori has the sword now, but we're still in the same environment. That's a new game state, but it's within the same environment. And because Ori has the sword, I want to change the music to reflect that Ori has a sword. I don't want the sad piece of music that played in when we arrived in this environment. I want a slightly more upbeat version of that music to reflect the fact that, hey, Ori has a sword. Isn't that pretty cool? All right, player, go and use it. And those two tracks on the soundtrack. The first track is Separated by the Storm. That's a sad one. And then that's basically the before. Literally the game state is called Before Get Sword. And then the music that plays with the game state called After Get Sword, the track on the soundtrack is called Now Use the Light We Want to See, the light being the sword. I
think I even wrote that one down as one of my favorite tracks. I when I was listening through it, I was just kind of making either some small notes or just like highlighting tracks that I really liked. Yeah. I liked how, because when Ori does get the sword, she, I don't know what Ori actually is.
It's whatever you want. It's whatever you want.
That's the beauty of it. And so for when Now Use the Light We Want to See plays, it's when I believe, I forget what they almost look like, they're like little like monkey looking things.
They're called the Moki.
The Moki. I literally just played it last night. I couldn't remember the name of the race, but the way they were all kind of gathered and like looking at Ori in awe, I thought was and so it, like you said, it kind of fits the music fits what is happening both in the story and in the game.
Well, the track title is literally a quote from the Moki. Literally, one of the Moki says, "Now use the light we want to see." And so I was like, well, that's another. I hate doing track titles; they're a nightmare.
I believe it.
Great, that's another one done. I'm just like, great, I can move on. But yeah, that's a very, very simple example of some game state changes. And now think about the fact that this is a Metroidvania and how many possible variants that there can be.
Because the whole purpose of that genre is just game state changes. You get a new ability or you get a new item or something like that. And now all of a sudden more of the game world is either opened up or there's existing places that you can explore more fully.
I'm going to give a couple more examples.
Go for it.
So one of my favorite examples, because it's so overkill, it probably wasn't necessary to do it, but I was like, screw it, I'm going to do it anyway. There's a area in the game called the Ancient Wellspring, and it has this puzzle room inside, which rotates every time you pull a lever. It rotates the entire level 90 degrees, and you have to do some more platforming. Now to get through this level, you have to rotate the room 3 times. Now the first time you enter the puzzle room, I can't really describe it as anything else. It's puzzle room music. I'm just going to call it that. Yeah. And it's like, okay, it's clearly a platforming challenge. There's no monsters in this room. Then when you pull the lever, you get the animation of the room turning. And then the music that plays is a very subtle variation of the initial puzzle room music. So We have puzzle room entrance music. The new game state is puzzle room entrance rotated once. And that's a new piece of music that is based on the one before. The only real difference is I add a couple more instruments, and the tempo is slightly quicker and the pitch is slightly higher. It's a brand new musical recording, though. It's not like a cheap trick done in Engine.
Would it be like a full key change or just a slightly higher?
It's a full key change. It's usually I think it's up a step each time. And then you pull the lever again, music changes again. That's another game state. And then you pull the lever again, and then one more time when you finish, and then the last game state is rotating room complete, and then that music plays until you get to the next game state. It's just all, and the person who decides where those game states are at is usually the audio director or the person in charge of implementing the music, or the composer, which in this case is me. I play through the game and think, it would be fun to change the music here. Is it necessary? Nah, probably not. Probably could have gotten away with just using the same puzzle room music. But I'm like, this room is so ridiculous and fun because it's literally a room that rotates in its entirety. I think I was like, I feel justified that we can have some fun with this without like it feeling too on the nose. And the last example I'll give is the approach to boss fight music. Now, boss fights were a new thing in Ori 2. We did not have them in Ori 1. We just had chase scenes in Ori 1.
Yeah, those escape sequences.
Yes. The chase scene approach was unchanged from Ori 1 to Ori 2. You have the same piece of music that plays and it just loops. It doesn't reset. We were just like, it ain't broke, doesn't need fixing. So let's just carry on with the approach. Everyone usually loves these escape sequences. Now, the boss fights are much longer, potentially, depending on your difficulty and your level of skill, and much more involved. And most of them have multiple phases. So I'm going to use the spider as an example. Spider has an intro cutscene. It's like you basically just walk across a trigger point, and then like a cutscene starts, and that's like your intro. Then the cutscene basically changes the environment to the first arena where you're going to fight the spider. And the music that plays there is your typical boss fight music. It's over the top, it's aggressive, it's spidery, whatever that means. But the music will play until you get the spider down to about 50% of its hit points. And then the gameplay transitions into a chase sequence. So this is phase 2 of the boss fight. And I'm like, okay, well, we have the visual justification to change the music here. Can we get the programming set up? So the programming is literally when spider hits 50% HP, music needs to transition on the beat. And that's something we would have struggled to set up without middleware in the first game. We probably could have done it, but with middleware in the second game, it was just a lot easier to set up. So then you get a little like chase sequence bit of music as you're doing the chase sequence. That's phase 2 of the music. And then because it was a platforming sequence, you're in a new arena. I'm like, well, hey, new arena, it's time to change the music again because we have the visual justification. You're noticing a theme here. If there's a visual justification for changing the music, then they're going to do it. Exactly. But the one final thing, and this is the real key, is that we can also shift the narrative of the music, because you can't. Okay, you can, but not really. I could have just played epic boss fight music that's scary for the whole boss fight, and probably people would have been happy. Like, probably it would have been fine. But what makes the spider fight memorable, it's a number of things. It's the multiple phases, but like in terms of the music, and again, I've read the comments, so I know I executed it well. Is the music shifts from being scary to being more like the tone of, hey, you're winning the fight, you can do it. And the amount of comments that said like, oh, when I got to this part in the music, I wanted to keep going. And I'm like, yes, that's the whole point. That was like, I wanted to be able to shift the music emotionally from being like, oh my God, this is scary, to like, oh, yes, you can do it. And that's something, to be able to tell a story within a combat sequence with music was like one of my favorite parts of doing this second game. And I just want to reiterate that nothing I'm doing is particularly innovative. This has been around since Shadow of the Colossus, probably sooner. Because Shadow of the Colossus had music that progressed the further you got in the boss fight. Yes. But it's all about the execution. And was there some thought put into put into it, so it's not just like epic boss fight music for 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes. Can we change the music to make it feel like it has a bit more of a narrative quality? And while I'm not going to spoil the end of the game, that does culminate in how it all comes together at the end. The last, let's say the last boss fight takes you 15 minutes to complete. There's a cutscene before that that's 4 minutes long, and then there's the closing cutscenes, which are 7 minutes long. So it's a 15, 22, 26-minute long sequence. The music from that first cutscene that preempts the boss fight, all through the different phases of the boss fight and the 3 different segments of the final cutscenes, can all be played back to back from start to finish with smooth transitions as a continuous piece of music. And that's probably the thing I'm most proud of. I'm proud of like how we as a studio like executed the ending, because it's an example of like where literally everything came together, and it's just one long big epic sequence, because the chances are once you trigger that final sequence, you're not going to quit until you finish the game. So
that's how it was when I beat it.
Yeah, exactly. So sorry, you've played Will of the Wisps, right?
I actually like the reason why I kind of gave that whole intro spiel about how important this, like how excited I was about this interview, is because, like I said, the original Blind Forest was my favorite game of the last decade. I literally have the collector's edition of Will of the Wisps with the soundtrack and the art book and everything. Like I love this series.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so the sequence I'm talking about, this I won't spoil it, but it's the cutscene from when you arrive at the Spirit Willow, and then all of that to the end should be completely continuous in terms of music, and it's just due to solid tracking of game states and making sure that we can transition on the fly when we need to, and it was just cool to be able to do that, because I had a dedicated person. He's a composer. His name's Guy Whitmore. He's a composer, but he's a genius music implementer. And I felt very lucky that I could just hand my music off. The way it worked is I type up a PDF of everything that I wanted. I'd also record a video with my tracks lined up to gameplay, with annotations of like exactly like what track was playing. And I was like, I need this to happen. Can you make it work? And between the PDF and my gameplay videos, he was able to set everything up in Engine, and because he's a composer, he could also make it work musically as well. He was able to, kind of understand what I was getting at, because I do not, and I have no interest in the technical side of things. Even though I can talk about how I did all that coding when I was 4 years old, I have no interest in it now. I do have interest, though, in how it is set up and how it plays back. But the actual nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of it, I just don't have the knowledge. I could probably try to learn it, but that would be less time spent composing. And I feel like I'm hired to compose, not to implement. But my ideas about implementation were executed by Guy for the second game perfectly, and that is also a result of having an increased budget, is that we could have literally a dedicated audio programmer to make sure that all of the music played back correctly. And he was also responsible for like a lot of the ambiences and cutscenes and stuff in the game. So he had an enormous technical role to play, and without him, the Ori music playback just doesn't work. Like it would just fall on its face, because there's so many things to track. Wow, I don't think I've talked so much about music implementation ever, but that like
that's fine. I hope it's interesting.
Yeah, I hope it's interesting, because it is a thing that often isn't discussed. But I think when gamers play, it's funny. You gave that quote about good music should be invisible. Music should be invisible unless when it's like meant to hit you in the face. It's the same with implementation. You should never be able to like. Good implementation should always be invisible, and bad implementation is usually very obvious when it's bad.
Yes.
Because like, why is the combat music still playing like 20 seconds after the fight is over? Like that's not good. So I'm very lucky that I had Guy to be able to implement all of my ideas, none of which were complicated in of themselves. But when you're doing all of this tracking within a Metroidvania, it's there's just an incredible amount of programming. And here's the things that people don't think about. What happens if you press pause in the middle of a transitional moment in the cutscene of the boss fight, like, or whatever, like all of these crazy variables that you have to think about? What happens if you're playing on PC and you alt tab out of the game? What happens to the music? What happens if you change abilities in the middle of a fight, which is very common in Ori? Like, what happens to the music? Does it continue? Does it stop? Does it dim in volume? Like all of these I had no idea like how many variables there were, and I'm just like, well, thanks, guy, because I would never have come up with like half of these things that you have to worry about. And that's so yeah. Next time when you play a game and like you're like, wow, the music is really smooth. Just like imagine like how many things are going on in the background to make sure that the music is playing back smoothly. It's like, yeah, it's just another example of like great music can only, or effective music can only be effective in a game when it's implemented properly. So it just doesn't matter. And this comes back to your budget thing as well. Even if you do have the best budget in the world recording the greatest music ever, if it's not playing back correctly in 2020, that's not good enough.
And people are going to notice.
Yes.
You're being very modest. Like you were talking before about how a lot of the stuff that you were doing about implementation and dynamic changes have all been done before. You referenced Shadow of the Colossus, but it seemed to me like to do it well, it's not necessarily, like you said, it's not necessarily innovative. It's more like you have to put in the work. And just the reference that the section that you mentioned of the puzzle, how it was like a 3-part puzzle with the rotating room and everything, and then even how the final boss works with the gradually changing and escalating tone of the music. That's a lot to do. Like you saw that puzzle section, you're like, this would be cool, and so you did it. Versus if it was someone like me, be like, oh, that's a nice puzzle section, here's a song. And then you have to put in the work. And even the sound designer that you're saying, what's his name again? I'm sorry, I want to make sure I give him credit.
Guy Whitmore.
How he thought of everything through that. You were talking about how, what's the music going to do if you alt tab? What's the music going to do if you pause? If you're changing weapons in between? I don't want to repeat all the examples you gave, but like you have to put in the work to make it go smoothly, to make it seem flawless and to make sure that it kind of plays into that idea of good sound design or good music is rarely noticed because it's doing the job so perfectly. So yeah, the next kind of question I want to talk about was a little bit of some of your other bodies, some of the other stuff you've worked on. Because I was looking at your credit list before this. Like obviously, I want to talk about Ori, and we've spent a lot of time on Ori. We could keep going, but like some of the other stuff I was just surprised by was your stuff for Minecraft. You did Ark Survival Evolved, which I have not personally played, but I know a bunch of people who have, and I also saw you've composed for a lot of short films and short movies. What are some of your favorite, or what was it kind of like working with Minecraft, and did that kind of like, were you able to get to work with Minecraft because of your already the relationship you already had with Microsoft?
That is exactly how it happened. Yeah. So Ori came out in March 2015, and then I still have the email. I think in May 2015, I get an email saying, "Would you like to pitch music for Minecraft?" And I'm like, "Does the sun rise in the morning?" And I didn't have any idea what it was going to become like. And I was like, maybe they just want some more ambient music, like as in the base game. But actually, they didn't want that at all. They were doing this mythology series, starting off with Greek mythology, and then it became Chinese mythology, Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology. And they wanted music that was very, very cinematic, and they wanted the music to make you feel like you were transported to a different time and place. And I was like, okay, it's like very, very different to the regular Minecraft. And they were like,
more ambient. It's kind of like minimalist.
Now there's still plenty of quiet music in the mythology series, but if you go to the Norse mythology, they were like, we want something harsh and aggressive, and I'm like, really, in Minecraft? And they're like, yes, because that is reflective of the time. And I was like, okay. I mean, I can do loud and hard and aggressive, and like I keep sending them tracks, and they were like, yeah, we want more. And I'm like, really? Okay. But as a result, I think it ended up standing out. The Norse mythology one is my favorite out of the four. But yeah, they I mean, I'll be honest, they commissioned a bunch of albums from me, and they were a direct result of Ori. And it was a very different working process, because obviously Minecraft's music there's no interactivity. It's just music that plays back like a jukebox for the most part. and it does change if you go into the Nether. But yeah, the music for Minecraft, most of those mythology packs was done in a time period for each pack was basically a month.
Oh my God.
Composition, orchestration, recording, all of it done from start to finish in a month. So they were like a different kind of challenge. But one of the reasons it was able to be done more quickly is because the brief was very, very, very defined. And obviously there's no interactivity to worry about. So I could just really focus on writing some music. I also knew that it was going to get recorded, and recording can cover up a lot of sins because the players make you look good. And yeah, so I've done those mythology packs. I also worked on a Pirates of the Caribbean pack for them, and then a couple of other like expansion packs. I think in total they've probably commissioned between 6 to 7 hours of music from me from 2015 to 2019.
That's crazy, and that's really interesting I didn't like that turnaround time is insane to me. I've asked this of other composers that I've had on as well. Yeah. Do you find that your most creative work is under those like strict time limitations? Because the expression limitation breeds creativity. Do you find that you work better under those strict timelines, or do you kind of prefer I don't know how long it took you to compose Will of the Wisps, but like, do you prefer a longer time period or a longer work cycle or a shorter one?
It depends. It really greatly depends on the game. I think for narrative games, I think the more time, the better. Like the more time you can get your teeth sunk into the story, it's just going to benefit you. I think I was on Will of the Wisps for a long time, and it was the same for Blind Forest. But it's not like I'm writing constantly, because it's what I write. Let's say I started writing Ori 2 in 2017, which is when we did our first trailer. If I started writing all of the music in 2017, the chances are I'm going to throw most of it out by the time we get to 2019, because I'm going to have a different perspective and the game's going to be further down the line. Mm-hmm. But the advantage of working on a game that early is that by the time you get to the point where you actually need to do the bulk of the work, so many decisions in your head have already been made because you're so familiar with the game that it makes writing quickly a lot more easy. Now, in the case of Minecraft, that's kind of what I'm getting at. So many decisions are already made. It's like Minecraft Chinese mythology. We need it to sound cinematic. Well, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to hire some strings and I'm going to hire some ethnic Chinese instruments. And now I just need to research the music to make sure I'm being reasonably accurate in my depiction of Chinese music. And then off we go. Just go and write some music. I'm also pretty well trained, and I can fall back on my theory and craft if I'm like struggling with writer's block or whatever. I have not struggled with writer's block for ages, but like it's a thing that can happen. But I've learned not to fight it. I've learned for me, my approach of defeating writer's block is to literally not fight it and just go and do something else, because then it usually resolves itself. Writer's block is me telling myself, or my brain being like, I need time to process what I'm about to work on.
I gotcha.
So it's like literally go for a walk, go play some games, go have a nap, like literally anything. And then when I come back, it usually starts to flow again. So the quick writing process. Don't get me wrong, it's hard. I believe it. But it's hard no matter what. Like music, especially because often the finishing touches on music often happen at the end. Like conceptualizing can happen real early, but like the end can be quite a manic time. If I talk about Ori's Will of the Wisps recording sessions were split into 2 dates so we have 4 days in December of recording and then a day in January. And just think about that for a second. Like we're recording in London with an orchestra of 70 players. Then there's a support crew of about 10 people. You've got to hire an engineer. You've got to hire 2 orchestrators. Who's printing the music? Who's getting all of the music simply on the stands in the right order so that the players know, are not wasting time on the clock trying to find the music that they're supposed to be playing.
Yeah.
There's well over 100 people involved. It's just a huge logistical challenge, especially when you consider there's more than 3 hours of music to record. And that's that's when it gets crazy, and that's when you kind of need to be well prepared. On the Minecraft stuff, it was the same. It's like, man, I got to write quickly so that I can get the orchestration team, up and running, and make sure that I'm ready to record in literally 3 weeks from now. But it's not unusual. I think my favorite story about quick film scoring is James Newton Howard did King Kong. I think it was in a month or a month and a half. And Alexandre Desplat did the Imitation Game soundtrack in 3 weeks, I think. So,
Dear Lord.
Because sometimes stuff happens, it's maybe there's maybe a new edit of the film like completely changes your approach, or in the case of King Kong, Howard Shore, who did Lord of the Rings with Peter Jackson. It's well known that they had a creative disagreement on that, and so they were like, well, now we don't have any music, so time to get James Newton Howard in. And James Newton Howard did a score in a very short period of time. So it's just one of these things that can happen from time to time. But with the training and with the amount of very, very, very highly qualified professionals that there are, like without my orchestrators, Zach Lemon, David Peacock, and Eric Buchholz, I'd be, again, nowhere, because it would be physically impossible to orchestrate the amount of music that was recorded for Ori 2. It would be physically impossible to do by one person in like the 2 or 3 week time frame that we had to get it all orchestrated. The only time I did orchestrate all of Blind Forest, but my God, I was like, I'll never do this again. Except I did do it again, actually, because I did do it on Ark. I did it on Ark, though, because I wanted to, and I also had time, because Ark was an early access game, so all of the music was basically written. And then they were like, let's have a recording. I'm like, great, okay. And then they were like, you've got like 3 months. And I'm like, okay, I can actually orchestrate all of this in 3 months. And I have to be honest, it was partly an ego thing, because I was like, I might never get to work with an orchestra that's 90 players. So I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do it myself. It's going to be a ton of work, but I'm going to at least say that my fingerprints were on every note and every orchestration choice. So if people don't like it, they can at least come back to me. But in the case of Ori, like I had too much other stuff going on, and trying to make sure that the music in the game is working and everything else. It's like, if you don't have a team of top-notch pros, the recording can fall flat on its face. And when you're recording, I mean, in London is probably the best place to record music for film or game. These musicians have never seen the music before. There's no rehearsal.
I was actually going to ask that if they sight read everything.
Yeah, so they sight read everything, because the orchestra I hired is a working orchestra. They have they might be playing Ori one day, and then the night after they're off to go play Beethoven now. So they're coming in, they're sight reading the music. So your notation has to be absolutely pristine and perfect to make sure that no time is wasted, because the amount of money being spent, I'm not going to give you an exact figure, but it's like, it's at least $10,000 an hour, and usually more. And if you go, that's a very like conservative
estimate.
So if you go over like by 1 minute, you're paying for actually 15 minutes. So it's
oh my God.
Yeah. So you're on the clock. And imagine you're on the clock, right? You're paying $10,000 an hour. One person asks a question about your music because they don't understand what's on the page. That's going to take 60 seconds. But then one of the things that happens is when one person asks a question, then everyone in the orchestra starts looking for nonsense in your notation. They're just like, oh, the violin player had a mistake. Maybe there's a mistake in my part. And then they'll start looking for stuff that isn't a problem. And then before you know it, you've wasted 3 or 4 minutes, which if you hadn't been talking, you'd have been able to do another take. I am pretty fastidious on preparation for recordings. I don't think there's many teams that could have recorded as much music as we did for Will of the Wisps in the time that we had. But it's one of those processes that is very, very involved, and like the preparation aspect is super important.
That's insane to me, just to think that they sight read the entirety of the score. Because when I was in band in high school and junior high and all that other stuff, like we did a little bit of sight reading, obviously significantly different level. But it's like sight reading was always one of those things where if it was just always probably the most difficult thing, especially for a bunch of, non-professionals. It's just a bunch of high school kids. But my favorite feeling is like we would get a piece of music, and if we nailed it, 80% nailed it on the first try for the site or during sight reading. It was like the best feeling in the world.
So
just to be able to do that.
The thing about these players is take one is usually usable. Like if we were really short of time, we could just be like, all right, we can use that. But take one is usable. Take two is usually very, very good in terms of the emotional aspect. And then take three is often the one that we end up using. So it's like Mora the Spider, which is one of the more difficult tracks on the soundtrack. What you're hearing on the album is literally their third reading of it ever.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's just kind of going along with more of like just talking about orchestras and whatnot or whatnot. What type, like what sections of the orchestra do you like to use the most, or do you like to compose for? Like when I was in band, I was part of the low brass. I played trombone. And I love a big low brass section when I hear it in music, when it's something other than just creating harmony or something like that, or using it for beat. I like it sometimes when they have a rhythm or a part of or they carry the melody for a little bit.
You'd like the Ark soundtrack then.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, so it's a very muscular score. So for Ark, just to give you an idea, you played in bands, so this won't seem big to you, but it's big for a typical orchestra. So for Ark, we had 4 trumpets, 6 horns, tuba, cimbasso, 1 tenor trombone, 2 bass trombones, and a contrabass trombone, which is quite a brass section.
Okay.
So and there's a lot of very, very rhythmic material. I am a brass player. My first instrument was piano. I'm still a pretty good piano player. But then my secondary instrument I started on trumpet, and then I started growing, and my lips just weren't growing right to continue playing trumpet. So then I went down to trombone as well.
That was literally my progression too. I started on trumpet. My band teacher is like, your lips are too big. I'm like, well, that's a weird thing to say to a kid, but okay. And then I switched over to trombone. Never learned how to read bass clef. I had to write down the slide positions.
Wow, okay.
I that's why I'm not a musician.
But yeah, I enjoy writing for brass when it's justified. It's funny because in Ori there is actually more brass than I was expecting, but it's mostly a smooth brass sound except in Shriek and Ori, where it's like actually like doing that spiky stuff that only British brass can really do. I think British brass has a very unique sound. That's kind of like highlighted. Yeah, it's going to sound weird, but I can tell the difference between British brass and American brass on soundtracks. It's pretty easy.
What would be like what's like a telling sign between American versus British brass?
I find American sounds to be slightly more hyped, whereas British sound is a bit more rounded, unless it's James Bond. And then even that is like a very specific kind of hyped sound. It's like the accompaniment is rounded, but then like the lead trumpet, I guess I feel like everyone in an American brass section is trying to be the lead, whereas the lead in a British brass section is literally the guy who's designated number 1.
Okay,
but that really is just like my personal perception of it. Like it could very much not be that, and it's not a criticism of the American brass sound at all. It's just sounds American as opposed to British. Also, I'm British, so I might have some inherent bias. It's just something I've become accustomed to hearing like on soundtracks. I like writing for brass, but I think. And it's pretty obvious on the Ori soundtracks, I enjoy writing for woodwind too. I mean, the chance to feature a bass clarinet, an instrument that never gets featured in anything, for Quolok's melody in Quolok's Hollow, was I knew I wanted a low reed instrument, but I cannot stand the bassoon. I think the bassoon is one of the most pointless instruments ever created. Now the contrabassoon, on the other hand, contrabassoon is great because it goes into a range that cannot be reached by hardly any other instruments. But low bassoon, what's the point? You can just use bass clarinet, and it's just a better sounding version of that. Low bassoon just sounds like a duck quacking. And then high bassoon, well, what's the point? Because you can just use English horn, which is just a way better sounding version of that, because English horn goes down to quite low. And I'm just like, well, what's the point in having a bassoon anyway? So there you go. I managed to get my rant about bassoon on this podcast. That was sorry to all bassoon players listening. I've just never liked the instrument. That said, there are bassoons on the Ori soundtrack and on the soundtrack. So I understand like why they have a purpose when it comes to the orchestra. And a fun Easter egg, there is actually one very short bassoon solo quite hidden away in Ori and the Will of the Wisps. It's a very specific place in the sanctuary area of the game. You have to go into a certain room to hear it. That's about as much of a hint as I'll give. I was just like, because it's kind of a thing amongst the video game music composer and performer community that I don't like bassoon. And I was just like, okay, I'll write a little solo. I'm going to do like a 30-second thing and then hide it in the game where it's absolutely not prominent at all.
It's even showing in your game, in your music design, essentially like I'm relegating you to this room that no one's going to get to, or very few people are going to get to.
One of the funny jokes I make about it's funny to me. One of the jokes I make about Blind Forest. So on Blind Forest, budget was limited, and people ask me, why does the score for Ori and Blind Forest sound so good? And my answer is like, well, I didn't use bassoon. Which is so bad. It's so bad, but it's become a running joke now. So I'm going to kind of continue
just
running.
Kind of play into it.
Yes, I mean I do generally prefer the bass clarinet though, and but just because the low notes on bass clarinet, like if you listen to that first low note on Quolok's Hollow, it's the second lowest note that is possible to play on the bass clarinet, and it's just so warm and inviting. And he's this giant toad. You haven't met him yet. It's a foreshadowing of his melody when you do actually meet Quolok. And that was one of the moments during the recording where I was like, oh man, I'm so glad I made this decision to record to do bass clarinet, because the bass clarinet for the Philharmonia Orchestra, he was extraordinarily good. It was just such an incredible sound that he created. It sounds so big, but it's just one instrument.
I love stuff like that. I think like would you say the bass clarinet is like your favorite, like how can I describe, not necessarily favorite instrument, because I feel like that's a very big statement, but more like for example, at least for me, the instrument I like to I'm always happy when I hear it in a score is the French horn.
Yep.
Like just because it has such a nice full sound to it when I hear it. What would be that equivalent for you? Would it be the bass clarinet or something else?
French horn is up there. I think we have something in common. It's like I think the good thing about French horn is that it has a huge range. Like you can go really low on the French horn, you can get that menacing dark horn sound, but you also get the soaring French horn sound, which I think in Ori is best represented in the Sandworm Chase. Like the horns really like go full all out on the melody in the Sandworm Chase. Also horns have like melodies for like the entire soundtrack of Ark. Horns definitely one of them. I tend to lean towards instruments with range. So the cello is up there because I think people don't realize how high the cello can go. Cello is up there. English horn also has range. I like the oboe, but oboe is just an inferior version of English horn as far as I'm concerned. Because where the oboe sounds good is exceptionally limited, whereas the English horn just sounds great across its entire range.
I actually had to Google what an English horn looked like. I'm so like I said,
it's a large oboe.
I have a small background in music, but I have enough that I can understand a lot of the basics. So I had to look it up real quick.
So English horn is the featured instrument in Separated by the Storm on the Ori soundtrack. It's also featured in the Windswept Wastes, and it's all over my Minecraft Egyptian mythology soundtrack, because English horn and Egyptian sounding music is just a sound that is very, very palatable. It's just a very moody instrument, very evocative, because it's still a reed instrument, but it has a deeper tone than the oboe, which when you play the low instruments on the oboe, it just sounds kind of bad. It's just not meant to be played down there. Where an English horn, for some reason, it just sounds brilliant no matter where you play it. And bass clarinet is kind of the same. It has that incredible low tone, but it can actually play pretty high as well. It's incredibly flexible. So I guess I would just say that I lean towards instruments which give me flexibility. There are some instruments which give you flexibility, and then there are some instruments which do like one or two things incredibly well.
I can understand that. Anything that has a big range, like you were saying with the cello, goes low to surprisingly high that a lot of people don't know it can go to. I only have a couple more questions for you because we've really like gone in like I know a lot of my listeners probably won't know a lot about this like really nitty gritty music, at least nitty gritty to me. Maybe it's more commonplace, obviously, in composing circles and whatnot. But I wanted to ask you, just we kind of we talked a little bit about some of your other work, and one thing I actually really wanted to ask was your work on Unspoken, the VR game by Insomniac. What's it like? Is there any difference in composing for a VR game versus a non-VR game?
I love this question when it comes up because the expectation is always that it's going to be like wildly different. No, the difference it makes is for sound rather than music. I think music, when you're thinking about it cinematically, music is going to function in the same way. The only difference where it might change is diegetic music that exists in the environment, but you're still scoring the experience the same way you'd score. It's really just, if we're being honest, it's hardly that much different to how you would score a first-person game. It's just that, just conceptually, what is different is how the audio around you and the sound and the dialogue is positioned. So a lot of it is more about spatial audio rather than what the music is doing. Music, narratively, it functions the same way. I do think, though, that you do have to take into consideration what the rest of the audio is going to be doing. So because there's imaging issues and panning issues, because the audio is happening all around you, you don't want to have stuff that is like shifting across the stereo spectrum in the music because it's going to become distracting. Like little things like that. But in terms of like the overall concept of like writing music, to me it's largely the same. And in the case of the Unspoken, which is literally a fighting game just with your hands, you're casting spells at your opposition. The music for the multiplayer aspect of the game functions in the same way as a Street Fighter or Killer Instinct or Tekken. And then for the campaign part of the game, the music is largely horizontal again because it's just following the story. There's considerations to make when playing with the sound effects and the dialogue, but other than that, not much of a change, at least in my very limited experience. But it's still, VR is still largely in its infancy, so I wouldn't want to be like saying that my answer is definitive just yet, because we're still very much evolving.
VR is in its infancy. I couldn't say that sentence.
It's in its infancy, but it is making money now, which is a good sign. I think probably still 5 to 10 years away from it becoming mainstream, because the problem with VR and the problem VR will always have until they solve it, is it's just not cool. Like,
I would even say accessibility. It's just expensive.
It's expensive, but it's also not cool. Someone needs to Steve Jobsify VR, and I think you get what I'm saying. Like, we need cableless VR, and it needs to not be a massive weight on your head. Like, no one wants to sit around with that thing on their head for a long time. I liken it to when Nintendo DS went to 3D. They were doing that 3D, and I'm like, but you don't have to like wear the glasses or anything. It's like, how are they doing that? Like that. It's that kind of innovation that is going to need to happen to VR for it to become mainstream, and of course the price issue, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So to kind of like, I'm going to kind of move off of game composition or game composing. Kind of my last couple questions for you are more personal ones, and I like to ask this to all the composers, and I'm assuming the answer is that you're too busy. But are there any personal projects that you are working on or you want to work on? But obviously, I know as a professional composer, your time is very limited. But have you been able to work on any personal projects?
I'm afraid I'm going to give the same answer that I would give anyone else. There are a couple of composers who have released personal projects in the last couple of years, but I can honestly say it's probably not going to happen for me for at least the next 2 to 3 years. There's things I would like to do. One of my favorite bands is a group called Hybrid. They're literally just called Hybrid. They do a lot of film score work, but they also have done albums. Their thing is very, very glossy and expensive sounding electronic music, and then they put an orchestra on top. It's incredibly well produced. Some might say overproduced, but I don't care. It's the kind of thing. It's the kind of thing that I enjoy listening to, because on a technical level, there is so much to learn from listening to them. and that's the kind of thing I want to do. It kind of because I do love writing electronic music, because I think the Unspoken shows, and I also got to show a bit of that in my score for Darksiders Genesis, which does go quite heavily into the electronic realm in a couple of tracks, but it also combines with orchestra. I would like to do an album of material like that, but I'm not going to do it unless I can do it properly. And so first of all, as I've hinted at, hiring orchestra is expensive, and there's no point. There's just no point in going cheap. Like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to go all out. So yeah, I'll wait a few years and see where the finances are at, write some tracks, and then it will happen. I just can't say when.
No, I getcha. And that actually it actually leads me into one of my other questions, which are, what's your favorite music or bands or even composers to listen to?
Yeah, so one of the things I always say is that I don't really listen to that many soundtracks, especially when I'm working on something. It's just it can influence your work too much. So I do like listening to electronic music, but not the dude bro EDM kind of stuff that is in one ear out the other. Like, I referenced Hybrid, that's a good example. The Crystal Method is a good example. The Prodigy, especially their older stuff, is a good example. It's music that still flows and has like musical interest to me, rather than just being a fat beat with some builds that are very artificial. So yeah, I do like, most people wouldn't expect that, I do like listening to electronic music, but it's partly because it's just so well crafted. Anyone that says, oh, doing electronic music is easy, has no idea how difficult it is. It drives me absolutely nuts when I hear that.
Years ago, well, I guess it's seven. When did Daft Punk win their Grammy? 2013, I think, when Random Access Memories came out. Yep. I remember one of my friends posted, saying, "Oh, I'm so happy they won," and someone commented, "Is like, why did they win a Grammy? They're just hitting buttons." I'm like, that's not like I'm not. I don't know music theory. I don't know music composition. But like, if you think it's just hitting a button, it's like, okay, say they even just hit a button, they still have to painstakingly program each note that you're hearing. So it's not
that's also a misinterpretation of, like, I think confusing their act with the actual music making process of it, because the buttons that they're triggering on stage are really just the phrases that they created themselves. It is granular DJing, I think is the best way I can think of to describe it. But they still had to come up with those riffs, and they still had to come up with those ideas, and then put them all together into a piece of music that makes people actually feel something. And that's not easy. Electronic music is something I enjoy listening to. I do enjoy listening to classic rock. Led Zeppelin is definitely up there with stuff that I listen to, just because it's incredibly progressive. The tracks just keep on going, man. And it's I feel like I learn a lot whenever I listen to them. In terms of composers, I'll just go through some classical ones quickly. I can also tell you who I don't like, because that's always fun.
If you want to answer that, it's fine. I never like to ask people, who don't you like, because then it's just kind of like, I don't know. I feel like
Well, I'm not going to rant about them, because it's just personal taste. So I love listening to Bach, particularly his organ music. I also used to be an organist,
okay.
I think his organ music is like about 200 years ahead of its time. The harmony is so progressive. I don't even know how it existed in that time period compared to other classical music that it was surrounded by.
Okay.
I am not a fan of the early classical era, so almost all of Mozart's music bores me to tears. There we go. I've literally just trashed Mozart publicly on a podcast. But his Requiem is amazing, except he didn't write half of it. Because he died.
I don't know much about classical music, so all that would be new to me.
Well, Mozart's Requiem is amazing. That's like a piece of music I can listen to at any time. It starts getting interesting for me with Beethoven. I tend to go for the heavier, more robust classical music. I think that's reflected in the music that I write too. My music is very layered. It's very dense. It does have moments where you get to breathe, but like when it's loud, it's really loud and it's really packed. That's just like a thing that I like doing. There are some composers whose like their identity is very clean and pristine, and it's not densely layered. I think Alexandre Desplat is a good example of that. Like you can really hear everything very, very clearly. It's pristine. That's if if Desplat is like has the cleanliness and pristineness of Mozart, then Hans Zimmer is like Rachmaninoff, which is like one of the heaviest Russian composers, Russian classical composers who I love. Like if you've listened to, again, you don't have to be familiar with music. You can just go look it up. If you look up Rachmaninoff's piano concertos, it's like really, really heavy, muscular, traditional sounding Russian music, and I love all that stuff. And then I will give some film scores that I do like listening to, and some game scores as well, because I know people probably want to hear that. We've already covered BioShock. I think Gary Scheinman, the composer of BioShock, is a genius. There's no one out there that sounds like him, in my opinion. He does his thing very, very well. One of my favorite soundtracks, and it's really not so much a soundtrack, it's more like the audio experience, is from Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice.
Okay.
I think that game is a masterpiece. I'm on record repeatedly as saying that game is one of the best games of the decade. Film composers, James Horner. I'm basically a big fan of all of the melodists, but also the melodists who maybe have brought their aesthetic into the 21st century as well. One composer who's a little bit maybe more left field that I enjoy listening to is Michael Danner, who did the music for Life of Pi. The film Life of Pi. I love that he's really good at combining world music with the traditional orchestra, and Life of Pi is his best example of that, and he won an Oscar for it. So I think that if you haven't listened to the Life of Pi soundtrack, go listen to it. I don't think you'll be disappointed.
And then my last project before we kind of wrap question, which has the word project in it, is what would be a dream project for you to work on?
So obviously I said that I am a massive fan of the Assassin's Creed titles. I would love to work. I feel like the Assassin's Creed games aren't going anywhere anytime soon.
Probably not.
If one day they feel I am worthy of even a chance to pitch for it, then that would be awesome. I think I'd be particularly suited, given that I spent 3 years in Japan. I think I'd be particularly suited for a game set in that part of the world. But if it's one of those things I don't have control over, whether I pitch for a project or not. But yeah, Assassin's Creed would be a fun one to work on. Another one is if they ever bring it back, I'm not sure they will, but I hope they do one day. I would love to work on a Mass Effect game.
Okay.
Yes. Again, narrative, storyline, sci-fi. It's just like I could play Mass Effect forever. That's a thing I would love to do. But I will say I'm currently working on a dream project right now that hasn't been announced. My involvement in it hasn't been announced yet, but it will be announced shortly, like as in very, very shortly. So that kind of that is probably actually a good place to wrap up on. I think, like, I can give your listeners the mysterious thing that is just around the corner. But it is a very, all I can say is it's a very, very well-known IP, and I don't think any composer would turn down the chance to work on it.
I'm looking forward to finding out what that is then. Okay, so to wrap it all up, thank you all for listening. Gareth, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. This was a really fun talk.
No problem. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for, we really got into it pretty deep.
Where can the people find you online? Any social media stuff or anything you want to plug? Obviously, Will of the Wisps is out and has been out for a month or two or a couple months now, but anything else, any social media or anything else you want to plug? I'm
on Twitter. That's where I'm most active. It's just my first and last name on Twitter, Gareth Coker. I have a website where you can actually hear pretty much every piece of music that I've written in the last 6 years. I'm also on Spotify if you want to take your music with me. I mean, I'm on it like every platform, so Google is your friend. But if you actually want to ask me questions or interact, you'll have your most success on Twitter. I'm more likely to respond on Twitter than anywhere else. I find the platform quite good for me, so that's the place if you want to follow up on anything that you've heard.
All right. And then, as usual for me, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Still Loading Pod on all of them. If you want to help the show out, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can give it a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcasting app you use, because that will help it'll help people find the show more easily, and it helps get the word out. If you want to support it monetarily, you can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. I'm part of the Podbeard Network. You can also check out all the great shows on the Podbeard Network. Go to podbeardnetwork.com. And my most important shout out, or most important plug, is the nonprofit organization I have been partnered with. Check out the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of children receiving inpatient care at hospitals. You can check out their website, bitbybitfoundation.org, and consider donating. And that should do it all for me. So, Gareth, once again, thank you so much for joining me for this episode.
No problem. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And I will see you all next time.